Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to first of all thank Oleg for his kind invitation to this workshop. So today I'm going to try to convince you that trying to understand in computational terms how visual attention works is going to be very important for the development of compelling experiences for virtual reality. To get us started, these are eye movement recordings. We have here 12 people. There are 6 males in blue and 6 females in red. And what we can see is that often there is quite a bit of spread in the kind of locations that they're interested in. Even so, sometimes everybody agrees on one particular location. So what this tells us is that there is probably some kind of common ground that we can find between people, but there will be also some individual differences. So why is this important for virtual reality? Well, in VR, you have the possibility of looking anywhere you want, and again, to try to create a compelling experience, it will be very important to try to achieve shared attention or a match on attention between what the content creator had in mind and what the user of the experience is actually going to experience. So this brings us to this idea of how can we try to understand how people find interesting or important or relevant information under time constraints. If you think about this, in principle, this is a very complex task. Is it that I need to attend to all the objects that are in the scene and then recognize each attended object in turn and finally evaluate the set of recorded objects against my goals? In practice, if I was to do that, I would be dead before I find a predator or a mate or some food. So there is evolutionary pressure to develop some simple heuristics or approximations that will guide attention towards that interesting or more important information. I will today tell you about 2 types of such heuristics that we have studied in the lab. One is bottom-up attention. How is it that we are guided towards salient or conspicuous locations in some kind of reflexive manner? And the other is top-down attention, which happens when we are trying to achieve a task and then try to focus our attention on the more behaviorally or task-relevant goals. So this is a simple model that we developed over the years for bottom-up attention. Here in the top left corner, you can see an input image, which is then processed through a number of visual channels, which we believe replicate what is happening in the early stages of visual processing in primates. At the end of this processing, information is combined into a single topographic salience map that is shown here at the bottom left. And this map simply highlights those locations that are more likely to attract the attention of the viewer. So you can see, for example, that there is a little hotspot in that map that corresponds to the bag of money in the original image. So with this kind of simple computational model, we can then present it a number of pictures that it has never seen before. And here the little yellow circles shows you the top 2 or 3 most interesting locations for this model. And you can see that often it tends to look at objects or persons or animals that we would expect should also attract the attention of a human viewer. So this brings us back to this idea of building a quick heuristic. This model doesn't understand much about the scenes, but is still able to make a reasonable prediction of where the most important elements might be in that scene. So, however, this is just the beginning, and in real life, we are often engaged in some tasks, and we don't want to just look at things that are popping out in the visual environment, but we also want to look at those locations that will help us achieve the task. So these are some older examples that I'm sure you are all familiar with, in which eye movements were recorded while people were doing different kinds of tasks, like observing a painting or arranging some colored blocks, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and so on. So in my lab, we have taken this further by looking at interactive video games. So here, a player is driving a car, and in this game they have to follow the rules of the road very strictly. And you can see the eye movement position that is being recorded from the player, which is that little cyan square. Here is another example, and I'll show you some results with this one, where you are basically running a hot dog stand in New York City. and you have customers that are going to come and place their orders. You have to manage the grill, make sure your sausages are cooked but not burnt, and assemble the sandwiches, and so on. So this is quite a complex task, and as you can see, the eye, and so the eye is still the little cyan square here, and the mouse, which is the little gray square, are moving in highly non-random manner as a human player is performing this task. Indeed, if you just look at the raw data, so this is just as a function of time on the horizontal axis, where did people look at, and you can see that at the beginning the player is focusing on number 11 here, the raw sausage, then alternating between number 10, sausage cooked, and the number 15, the hot dog pool, and so on, right? So clearly the behavior is far from being random, and there is clear structure into how people approach this kind of task that is given to them. So how can we capture this in a model? In general, we are interested in trying to predict what is the probability that attention will go to a particular location next, given the mental state of the user. So of course the mental state is something that we cannot directly measure, so what we are going to do in this work is try to infer it from the sequence of previous fixations. And so we are building, in this particular work, we are building a dynamic Bayesian model which is going to take into account what is the sequence of all the objects that have been visited so far, all the things that the player has already looked at, and from that try to make an inference as to where they are going to look next. So we hope that this model basically can capture some simple contingencies, that if you have already looked at the sausage, for example, then the next thing that you should look at is the hot dog bun, or maybe have a look at a customer, and so on. So I'm going to skip all of the mathematical details and just show you some results here. So if you first look at the top left, this is just the original frames of one particular run of this game, and the eye position recorded from the player is that little red circle. You can then look at panel number 9, which is the model that I just showed you. And here we are just showing you the recorded eye position, still that little red marker, and also the prediction of the model, where the model thinks the player should be looking at that particular point in time. And again, this is based on the analysis of where the player has looked at so far, and then trying to make the predictions for the next time point. So if you thought that you had free will in this kind of game, you can see that on panel 9, the blue and the red are overlapping for a vast majority of the time. And so that means that indeed the model was successful in capturing those contingencies that relate, what you have looked at so far and where you should be looking, next. To try to go a little bit deeper into this, we have started looking at things that are getting closer now to virtual reality environments, even so this one is still on regular 2D screen, which are immersive video games. And so in this one, what we are going to try to do is not only try to predict the next location of attention and the next eye position, but try to predict the current state of the user and which action the user is going to do next. So here you can see that the user just shot an airplane, and let's see whether we can actually predict when those events occur based on an analysis of the eye movements up to time t, and then predict whether one of those events is going to occur in the near future. So the way in which we are going to do this is, first we record when those events occur. So here, each time that little broken line goes up, that means that a target was destroyed during that particular run of the game. And we are going to consider plus or minus 5 seconds around each of those events, and then collapse all of the data aligned on the time of the event. Around each event, we are going to look not only at the video frames, but we are also going to take them to process them through the models, and hence compute over those frames both the bottom-up prediction from the saliency model and also top-down predictions from that Bayesian model that I showed you previously. once we have those two, we are going to now consider the eye movements of the player, and in real time we are going to record how much agreement there is between the eye position of the player and the prediction of those two different models. So here is the result, again taking all of those events and lining them up on time 0 when the target destroyed occurred. And you can see that what we observe here is, if we look on the vertical axis, this is NSS, which is a normalized scan-sparse salience score. The actual score is not so important as the pattern that we observe. So you can see that for that particular event, maybe 1 or 2 seconds before the actual event, there is a sharp increase in the agreement between the eye position of the player and the bottom-up model, and conversely a decrease in the agreement with the top-down model. So what we can do based on this is now basically build a classifier in which we are going to look for those shapes of in the agreement curves between the bottom-up and the top-down model. And if we apply this, let me skip that. This is just another event, just to show you a different shape. If we apply this, we can then detect those events, and again we are going to detect them usually about 1 or 2 seconds before they actually occur. Okay, and here you can see the performance, which is pretty good if we use both the behavior and the stimulus. We get slightly worse performance if we only use the eye movements, so not analyzing the video at all, but just trying to build a classifier just based on the pattern of eye movements that people are making. And likewise, we get a worse performance if we only use the stimulus alone and we don't use the eye movements. So basically what this tells us is that by recording eye movements and applying computational models to analyze the eye movements over time, we are able to get some insight as to what the current mental state, or the current progression in the task for the user is, and possibly what their next action is going to be. So this, I believe, is very important for virtual reality applications, as it can give you some insight as to what your user is currently doing and what they are planning to do next. Here is just to show you an example with a different kind of game. Basically the same idea. In this case, we are looking at events where the player is going to start speeding up, and we can find again a different pattern. The classifier is not as good here, but still significantly above chance. So I would like to add one more facet to this, which has to do with how can we make sure that those models actually represent what we believe is happening in the human brain. So to try to validate the model, what we have done recently is to look at the different brain areas that are shown in this little diagram, and see whether we could establish a direct correlation between what the model predicts and neural activity in one of those areas. And the target area that we decided to use is the supercolliculus, marked SC here in that little beige rectangle, because of its particular location and its particular pattern of connection with the other structures in the brain. So the colliculus, first of all, receives direct input from the retina, also additional inputs from visual cortex, and most importantly, it is directly connected to the brainstem that will then activate the eye muscles. So it is kind of a hub that fuses visual inputs and then produces the motor behavior to actually activate the eye movements. We are not the first ones to look at this. Here is an example of a previous paper in which the group of John Delan Haynes used fMRI to try to look at whether there would be correlation between patterns of activations in the human brain and saliency as predicted by our model. And they found several areas of significant correlation, which are the usual suspect, the frontal ice field and the posterior and anterior intraparietal sulci. Here, however, what we wanted to do was to see whether we could directly put electrodes in the supercolliculus, and so we are not going to do that in humans, but we are going to do that in monkeys that have very similar brain structure as we do, and see whether we could have a more direct correlation between the firing of a single neuron and the activity as predicted by the saliency model. So this is work with Doug Munoz group in Canada. So here is the basic setup. We are going to have monkeys watch videos like this. So this is like BBC Planet Earth and this kind of videos. And the current eye position of the monkey is that little square. And the receptive field, or the part of the visual space that the neuron under study is sensitive to, is shown by this circle. And so those neurons, they have so-called retinotopic receptive fields, so their region of sensitivity moves as the eye is moving over the visual scene. We can then, first of all, transform the visual input into supercolliculus space, which is highly distorted. It's a little bit the same idea as you may know that your retina has very high resolution towards the center of gaze, but much lower resolution in the periphery. The same phenomenon happens and is actually emphasized in the supercolliculus, where there is over-representation of the central part of the visual field and a much coarser representation of the periphery. Once we have this representation, we can then compute the salience map in real time over those transformed video frames, and we are now ready to do our direct correlation. So whenever the saliency from the model is high inside the circle that corresponds to the receptive field of the neuron, we are going to test, is the neuron going to fire more strongly at those points in time. So here the electrodes go in the colliculus, and here is the basic result. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary of this for today. So the main result is that it worked exactly as expected. So here, if we line up all the fixations, so time 0 represents the onset of every new fixation at a particular location on the scene. And we are going to use the model to compute the salience in the receptive field of the neuron during that fixation. And so this gives rise to those three curves that are basically three tertiles of salience level. So the high, medium, and low salience gives us the thickness of the lines of the three curves. Okay. Then we are going to measure for each of those tertiles what was the actual activation of the neuron that we recorded from. And indeed, again, as expected, we find that when the model predicted that the salience inside the receptive field of the neuron is currently low, then the activation that we recorded, so the number of spikes per second that we recorded from the neuron, was indeed low. And conversely, when the model predicted a high salience, which is the sick curve, then the neuron also fired much more vigorously. So this gives us, for the first time, a direct empirical validation of these kind of models that I've shown you today. In that, basically, we have a direct correlation between model predicted salience and the firing of individual neurons in the monkey brain. So as I said, there is a lot more depth to this study, but I'm going to skip this for today, and I'm ready to answer any questions that you may have after this. I would like instead to spend the remaining few minutes to tell you about one last aspect of this, which is now not only looking at instantaneous attention, where am I going to look next, what is attracting my gaze, also going beyond those short-term events, am I going to pull the trigger in the next couple of seconds, and so on. Now looking at also using these kind of models to detect long-term traits. And so the basic hypothesis here is that if, again, we go back to this circuit of brain regions that processes visual input and eventually gives rise to eye movements, we can see that this is a heavily interconnected circuit. And so we hypothesize that if there is anything going wrong in any of those brain regions, that should give rise to a decipherable signature in your patterns of eye movements. So the way in which we tested this was to look at now patient populations. So here we have 3 groups of individuals. They are control children in blue, children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, in red, and children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in green. So ADHD and FASD are very interesting disorders because they are very poorly understood. And right now there is no simple gold standard or simple blood test that you can do to diagnose those. And often they are being confused by the clinicians, even so the treatment for those 2 diseases should be totally different. Let me skip this. So the methods here are going to be quite simple. It's very similar to what I've shown you so far. We are going to record eye movements while the participants simply watch a few minutes of videos. And we are then going to compute 3 different types of features. So we are first going to use a saliency model to compute saliency maps, and here we break it down for the different channels that contribute to saliency, color, intensity, orientation, and so on. So that will give rise to a first set of features, which is going to be based on the agreement between the eye movements of the observer and the predictions of these models. We are then going to look at the second set of features in addition to this, which are simple oculomotor features. So just looking at histograms of saccade amplitude, so how big of eye movements that this person typically make, how fast is the eye moving, how long the saccades last, what is the intersaccadic interval, so how long their fixations are lasting. And finally, we are going to look at a third type of features, which is comparison with a group of young adult control observers. So here the heat map that you see is built from a dozen USC students. We recorded their eye movements, and then we just paint a little Gaussian blob at the location where they are looking. And so here we can now measure the similarity between the current participant under test, which is the little red dot. We can ask, is that person looking at the same locations as this group of typical students we're looking at. So we further break down the features. So from those 3 types, oculomotor, saliency, and group-based features, we can further break it down into the sub-features, and then we further break that down into different points in time. So looking at the first saccade after each transition from one scene to another, and the second saccade, and so on. And finally, we can develop a classifier to try to then see whether there is enough information in the eye movement recording and in this joint analysis of the video and the eye movements to actually make a difference between the groups. So I'm going to show you first with the children, and then also we'll look at Parkinson's disease in elderly patients. So in children, it worked quite well. So overall, the accuracy at the 3-way classification, ADHD, FASD, or control, was about 77%, which is way above chance. That would be 40% in this case. And more importantly, what we can do now is ask which kind of feature was different in each of those diseases. And we can here do it just for the 3 groups, oculomotor, saliency, and group, or we can further break it down into the individual features that we used. And so the important message here is that you can see that for each disease, for example in this case ADHD, has a very different signature, and the signature here is based on the solid dots. Those are the ones that are significantly different in ADHD versus control. And if we compare this profile to the one that we obtained for FASD, you can see that it's a very different signature. So for the first time here, we have a completely objective and completely quantitative way of estimating this long-term trait of our participants, in this case, whether they have some kind of neurological condition. So the results for Parkinson's at completely the other end of the age spectrum are similar. It actually worked even better here, almost 90% correct. And again, a completely different signature for those individuals compared to ADHD or FASD. More recently, we are now looking at this in conjunction with other techniques, so other eye movement measures, also looking at diffusion tensor imaging in MRI, and basically using all of those measures to try to build a decision tree that would help the clinician in deciding whether a person has one of those conditions. And so we can start with, for example, doing 5 minutes of eye movements and maybe a little structured eye movement task, and then based on those results decide whether we want to run more tests and so on. So I hope that in this talk, even though I have never really worked with any direct application to virtual reality, this is actually something that we are starting now with Jessica Brilhart, who provided this video. And we quickly realized that if we are trying to convey a message in virtual reality where people have the freedom to look anywhere they want, really trying to understand how attention works and trying to predict where people are going to look at and trying to predict what is going to engage them is the key in trying to create an effective immersive experience. So with this, I would like to just give you a brief summary. So I've shown you a number of different models that are trying to address the problem of how can we understand visual attention. As I said, this is a hard problem, and especially when you are trying to look at task-driven attention, because different tasks give rise to different behaviors, and so the models have to be able to take that into account. We not only develop the models, but I've also shown you how we can validate them directly against, in our case, single unit recordings in monkeys, and how those models can be used not only to make predictions of eye movements, but also to make short-term predictions of the internal state of the user and their intentions and their future actions, for example, pulling the trigger or speeding up and so on. And in addition, can also be used to predict longer-term traits of the participants. For example, if they have a neurological disorder, but probably the same kind of classifier could be developed to predict their overall preferences or their overall orientations in various dimensions. So with this, I would like to thank the people who did the actual work, all of my students and collaborators, and of course to acknowledge our funding sources. And I will be available now to take any question that you have. Thank you.